Hello, everyone. We have our keynote speaker, Mr. Sam Bankman-Fried. He is the CEO and founder of FTX. And today he is going to be talking, of course, about FTX. And it was he founded before finding Alameda and then FTX. Sam was a trader on Jane Street Capital's international ETF desk. He traded a variety of ETFs, futures, currencies, and equities and designed their automated OTC trading system. He graduated from MIT with a degree in physics. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm gonna talk some about Serum and Solana, about DeFi in general, where it is, where it's been, where I think it's going. Y'all should also just feel free to ping with questions in the sidebar thing here. It's 60% chance I'll figure out how to read them, and if so, towards them over the course of this. Anyway, and again, thanks so much for having me. When you think about where DeFi is going, and there's obviously a lot of different parameters there, and part of the hope is that it becomes something that's really big, and that it becomes something that's a lot bigger than it is today. And there's some metrics by which it's big today. There's tens of billions of dollars of value flowing through the DeFi ecosystem, but there's only tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of users, which is not nothing, but it's less than the number of users of even the larger centralized crypto exchanges today. And so this isn't a mass market phenomenon yet. This is mostly something which is internal to the crypto ecosystem. But it obviously plays a really big role in the narrative around crypto, and around what crypto could become. And so, what gets us, from here to there, so to speak. And I think that there's a number of things that need to happen. A big one of these is solving scaling. And this is not an easy thing to solve. The core of it is that right now, on Ethereum, you can get about 10 total transactions per second going through the network. And if you look at how many do you need for DeFi, well, I don't know. It depends on what DeFi is and becomes. But just to start off with, right? What if you want to put one giant company on a blockchain? Take your favorite, really, really big company, right? Something that 1 billion people might use. Whether you're looking at something from finance or social networks or something else, you're sort of going to see something kind of like 1 million transactions per second, right? If you look at tweets per second, Facebook likes per second, trades per second, those are the sort of numbers that be as few as 50,000 for some of the less intensive programs, maybe as much as 20 million for some of the more intensive programs. And you can sort of go through this process yourself, but I think that's about where it tends to end up for a gigantic company. And that gives you a hint as to how big blockchains would need to get in terms of capacity and throughput, in order to really start to touch what they could be in their potential. And it means you have to be talking kind of about millions of transactions per second, probably, just a lot. And it's not just that it's bigger than 10, which is sort of where we are today. It's bigger than 1,000. And I say 1,000 because that's where alts are. In fact, that's where a lot of fast, blockchains are. And I think what you run into actually is that a lot of scaling solutions for crypto just don't scale enough. They're enough to scale so that today's ecosystem could comfortably use cryptocurrencies, but they're not enough to scale such that tomorrow's could. At least not in the cases we're all looking forward to. So anyway, that's just, I think, a really, really important backdrop to think about when you think about scalability. Is anything that says 5,000 transactions per second, it's a big improvement, but It's actually not enough of one. And so what can you do? You can either have a single something, you call it layer 1, layer 2 blockchain, roll up, sidechain, whatever you want, has 1 million transactions a second. Or you can kind of patch together 100 of them, each of which have 10,000 transactions per second. And that's sort of what, things like sharding are like, where you take sort of like independent chains, each of which is a few thousand transactions a second, and then you sort of weave them together. And it's a really cool idea. The problem with it is, like, you can imagine what happens if you took Twitter and you sort of sharded it between like 100 different shards, right? Like Bob would tweet something, and to Jim, say, "Hey Jim, do you see my tweet?" And Jim's like, "Nah, I didn't see your tweet." I was like, "Why not?" Well, Jim says, I'm on Twitter shard number 71. That's where my account is. I was like, "Oh yeah, sorry, no, I'm on 53. So guess you can't see my tweets." Like, that's what happens if you have sort of like, each shard representing like 1% of the universe, and maybe on like an hour-long time frame, you could have interactivity between them. But what we don't have is sort of real-time interactivity, and you sort of get variants of this in a lot of cases where, I think sharding can be super powerful, but you sort of need to at least be able to get, like, at the very least, you kind of want each program to not have to be split between shards, right? Like single programs should be on single shards, and ideally even like, ecosystems or like, sectors. And so again, I think you kind of want to get to like a million TPS per shard, sort of. And just very, very few blockchains are even trying to get there. I think there's a decent chance that a lot of this tech hasn't been built yet. And, I don't think that blockchain tech is a solved problem. I will say that, I've sort of been involved in the Serum and Solana ecosystems. And what is that? Well, Solana, it's a blockchain. And the thing that sets it apart is that it really is shooting for that much TPS, for, millions eventually. It's, probably the fastest today at 50,000. But what really makes it different isn't the speed today, but it's the roadmap that is, like, really, really actively shooting for way more than that. And so many blockchains, they sort of like have their current speed or a roadmap to get to a few thousand, and that's sort of that. And much of a roadmap to get beyond that. I see someone asking, how about ETH2? As far as I understand, now, of course, ETH2, it could become anything, right? And so, and I don't want to try and box it in, but if you look at what ETH2, I think, is currently understood to be, with sort of the current iterations of it, or drafts of it, you're generally looking at something which is like, 5,000 transactions per second per shard, and then a lot of shards. And so you could scale to large total network throughput in some senses, but it's going to have trouble fitting any single large applications on it, and composability doesn't work very well, at least not sort of like real-time composability between shards. And so when you look at a sector that you want to have interacting products in, once again, you sort of like have this issue where 5,000 TPS is not enough to have a sort of like interacting composable ecosystem long term. So, I think that, like, the way that I think about this, and sort of to sort of like respond to some other things I see people sort of asking here is not to say that sharding is bad, because I do think that at some point, like, there are real advantages to it, but that you sort of first want to get as much as you can on one single, like, natively composable shard, like on one track that is just totally real time interacting. And then once you have that, then you might want to duplicate that, in parallel lines, with like slightly more awkward composability between them. But I don't think you want to sort of phone it in too quickly. Like, I think you want to build out as much as you can on each thread before you start duplicating the threads, because you do lose a lot when you start duplicating. So that's sort of like my thought on this. I should mention, like, other people disagree with me on this, so to take this with a grain of salt. This is just sort of my bullshit thoughts. Um, I but I do think it's like really, really important for the ecosystem to be thinking about this, because this is what's gonna, really determine a lot of the future of DeFi. And, it's one of the hardest parts of it to get right. It's one of the parts that you need to put lots and lots of work and testing into to get right. And you can't just sort of like at the end be like, oh yeah, let's jack it up 100x. Like, no, it's going to take years of design. And so I do think that that's sort of a fundamental thing that you want to be thinking about now. And when you look at dApp design, the sort of like way that you're designing these is going to depend somewhat on the technology it's being built on. It's not that hard to translate, but it's not trivial. And so again, when you think about something like the EVM, which is the Ethereum virtual machine, it is the most common by far way to be building decentralized applications right now. It's also not built for mass scalability in a single shard. And that's why you don't generally see EVM compatibility being prioritized as much for something like Solana. It would be very useful in some senses, but anything that was built using it, the risk is that it ends up not being able to take advantage of the faster throughput of Solana because it's being built in a way that isn't sort of natively parallelizable. And that is maybe just to get to like what is sort of the big philosophical distinction between, say, ETH2 and Solana. ETH2 takes a bunch of basically totally independent shards and then sort of layers on top of ways for them to, on long timescales sort of interact with each other. Solana takes parallel transactions that are each block syncing up with each other. And you can think of it as doing sort of what like memory stores do, where you can have like 100 people simultaneously trying to submit transactions to the blockchain and to just all go through. They all are syncing up with each other, layering on top of each other. And if two people are both trying to affect the same memory cell, then whoever got there first sort of block out other people for a second or two, until that sort of like propagates through. But if two people are sending, actions that don't overlap in terms of what memory cells they're supposed to be affecting, then they can basically happen in parallel, and it doesn't actually matter which sort of goes first or second. And that sort of is the way that Solana views parallelization. And again, I sort of bring it up because I think it's a super cool tech, but I don't want to say that it definitely will be Solana that things are built on in the future, because who knows, right? I think it's cool, but like maybe there's going to be new technology that's built, right? What matters in the end is that good tech is built, and is able to to really move the space forward. That's I think that's sort of the biggest thing that's going to determine what programs we even can build. And a big part of this is we should be holding ourselves to a really fucking high standard with DeFi programs. And I think this is the other thing that I tend to have like a somewhat different take on than I think a lot of people in DeFi. I think that DeFi is extremely high upside and could be really cool and really powerful and has really new advantages. I also think that in order for it to be able to access those advantages, it's gonna have to be a really great user experience. People are gonna have to love using DeFi applications, and if they don't, you're not gonna get that many people switching over from non-decentralized to decentralized applications. They have to be able to win on their own merits, not relying on the fact that they're decentralized, in order for the masses to be willing to use them. Now, if you can get there, I think people will be excited about the decentralization for them. But I think step one is you can't turn them off with the user experience. And right now, I think most DeFi products do, just because it's a new field. It's hard to build in DeFi. You're doing it tied behind your back, because if you screw anything up, you sort of like barely you maybe can't even patch it, right? It's like immutable code on the blockchain sometimes, and so it's not easy. The entire sector hasn't been around that long, and it's competing with like very well built applications. And a lot of these teams aren't that structured, which is part of the nature of it. But I do think that building really, really awesome products is an important piece of this. And I don't just mean awesome theories. I mean like enormous thought going into the GUIs. I mean thinking hard about where each button is placed, right? Like I don't know, at FTX, like we get customers like yelling at us constantly if we put a button on the wrong part of a page, so it's annoying and there's too much mouse scrolling involved in clicking it. That's a sort of level that this is true of like most large centralized exchanges, and people building DeFi GUIs have to think the same way. They have to think of themselves as really being held to building an unbelievably well-tuned experience. Responding to some other things people brought up, what are sort of like, are there trade-offs here? Is it just like one's better than the other, or like how would different chains, like are their costs aligned? Yeah. So first of all, and sort of like lines up with some other people have said, it's not built on the Ethereum virtual machine. It's not built on Solidity. And, that means that current blockchain developers need to adapt to a new environment. And it means you can't copy paste apps over from Ethereum. That's a barrier to entry. The other thing, though, is you're just stressing the system more. If you're trying to build something that is very high throughput, that puts stress on everything. And that's true if it's decentralized or not, right? Like FTX, when we built FTX, there's a lot of stress on a lot of pieces of that system. It takes a lot of work to have that never fall over, right? When things get busy, people are trying to send hundreds of thousands of orders per second on FTX. And we need to have 100% uptime. It's just like I'll sort of give one anecdote, which I think I've probably given before in some places. But we once had a couple minutes of effective downtime on FTX because of the following reason. It's like Chinese New Year, and as part of that, we uploaded some banner to the website. I did a picture on it, had some text. Turned out it was a very high resolution picture of a dragon, like very high resolution, and we weren't very careful about putting that very, very sharp dragon sufficiently behind various firewalls. And immediately someone caught this and started just requesting to download this dragon image like hundreds of times, thousands of times a second, and took down the FTX GUI from it. And that's sort of like one of many pieces of the system. That's a pretty extreme example, but it's just like everything gets stressed in ways you don't even realize it will when you try and scale something. And so when you sort of look at like at what happened with building a really highly scaling blockchain, well, all of the nodes have to do a lot more. You're just processing way more messages, right? You need to have like a more robust node infrastructure. It needs to be running on more powerful machines. They're not incredibly expensive. They cost hundreds of dollars, though. You can't. You sort of like have to be running like pretty well-tuned software to do it. You don't have massive margins for error in it. If all of a sudden there are massive spikes in volume from the high baseline to an even higher level, you have to worry about whether the nodes will even be able to keep up with that and produce blocks in time. And then you look at all the other infrastructure. How about RPC servers? Like servers whose entire job are basically to serve APIs to dApps to be able to keep up with all the requests and all the data, and they need to be able to store all the data. As you see, like all these things that stress the system, and it's doable, but it's harder. to keep up with. And so I do think that's sort of like, something to keep in mind whenever you try and scale DeFi, is that like everything gets harder in ways you forget. And I think that's an important thing. One thing which I actually want to touch briefly on, I think is probably top of mind for some people, is there's been a lot of talk about the infrastructure bill. This is a proposed bill in the United States around taxation of crypto, and there's been some thought that it might touch on DeFi some, and as what's going on there basically, interesting and complicated area of law in the States, but also globally, which is there are lots of businesses that have various legal obligations. One example is that some businesses have an obligation to report their transactions to the IRS for tax purposes, so that the IRS, knows who owes tax on them. Think what you will about that. That's sort of how the world is in general. And now you take an autonomous smart contract on a blockchain, right? And you're like, go, Mr. Smart Contract, please file the 1099s. Smart contract says nothing because it's a smart contract, not a person, and it can't understand English. And it sort of creates this really interesting tension. That's sort of underlying a lot of the regulatory questions around DeFi. And it starts to ask these complicated questions about who does have regulatory duties in this system, and what does that mean? What are the analogs? And so anyway, there's sort of, have been various drafts of a bill floating around about who has the duty to report transactions for tax reasons to the IRS. And, some versions have referenced DeFi, but it's unclear exactly what that means, because it's not clear who the right parties would be in DeFi for it. And some worries have been that this would accidentally hit even mining firms, which I think is not the intention. Anyway, I know that I'm starting to come up to to time here, and I don't want to keep you guys too long. Hopefully this was at least a little bit interesting and useful for people. So, thanks so much for having me.